Welcome to a place where love isn't polished with fairy tales, but told with the rawness of truth. Here, stories are not about perfect beginnings, but about choices, sacrifices, and the unpredictable fire of desire. Imagine a union chosen not for passion, but for wealth, a bargain that chains the heart in silence, yet slowly stirs a longing no riches can satisfy. Feel the shift as tender touches awaken hidden cravings, when intimacy turns from duty into a storm of secret passion. Walk into the conflict where nights of fire blur the line between genuine devotion and a life bought by gold, leaving behind both guilt and yearning. And finally, witness the transformation, when what started as a transaction becomes a love so deep, so consuming, it outshines every treasure in the world. These stories are more than words. They are journeys into the most fragile and powerful corners of the human heart. If you've ever questioned what love truly means, you've just arrived at the right place. The choice was never about love. It was about survival. When the proposal came, it did not arrive wrapped in roses or whispered promises of eternity. It came in the form of gold, security, and the escape from a life that had grown heavy with hunger, debts, and the sharp edges of loneliness. Standing before a man whose face carried more years than mine, the vows I spoke sounded hollow even in my own ears. Every word tasted of a bargain where comfort was traded for youth, and wealth weighed heavier than passion. The first nights were the hardest. The silence inside the grand house echoed louder than any argument I had ever known. Marble floors, silk sheets, chandeliers that spilled golden light. Every corner seemed to whisper of the cost I had chosen to pay. At night, lying beside a man whose hands were steady but aged, whose breath carried the rhythm of time already lived, the heart felt like a prisoner trapped in its own chest. His touch was gentle, never cruel, yet it carried the reminder that tenderness was not the same as desire. Eyes closed, waiting for sleep, I often wondered if this was what a lifetime would feel like. Silken chains and gilded cages, days passed in a blur of wealth's shallow glitter. Dresses that shimmered, jewels that caught the light, servants who bowed with every step I took. To the world, it looked like a dream, but inside the dream was a silence that burned. Food tasted rich but flavorless, laughter felt rehearsed, and every smile was painted over with the quiet truth that it was never born of love. Friends envied the life they saw, never knowing that inside the palace of wealth stood a heart that longed for something simpler, something warmer than gold could ever be. And yet, in the stillness of those nights, there were moments that unsettled the certainty of my choice. His hand resting over mine, not demanding but simply holding. His voice telling stories of years I had not lived, speaking of struggles, mistakes, and regrets that made the lines on his face suddenly human, almost fragile. For a moment, it felt like wealth had not bought me but rescued me, and in those flickers a softness stirred. It was not love, not yet. It was something quieter, something like understanding, the faintest whisper that maybe hearts could learn what they had not chosen still. The emptiness lingered. When he kissed me, the kiss was tender but lacking the fire that youth craves. When his body leaned into mine, the warmth felt more like safety than passion. And safety, while precious, did not fill the hunger that lived deep within. Nights were long, filled with the sound of rain against windows or the ticking of clocks in rooms far too big for one's comfort. Sometimes tears slipped down silently, not from regret, but from the ache of not knowing whether love could ever grow in soil planted with convenience. But time is a patient teacher. In the daily rituals of life together, in the way his eyes softened when they looked at me, in the quiet sacrifices he made without asking for recognition, a shift began. What was once duty slowly grew into something more complicated. The arms that once felt heavy with years became the only arms that gave rest from the storm outside. His laughter, rare but genuine, carried warmth that melted the cold marble halls. Slowly, the chains of silence loosened, and the cage began to look less like a prison, more like shelter. And then there were the nights when the silence gave way to closeness that went beyond expectation. His touch, though not young, carried patience, care, and depth. The passion was different. It was not the reckless fire of youth, but the steady burn of a flame that refuses to die. It surprised me, the way my body responded, the way his presence filled not just the room, but the emptiness that once haunted me. In those moments, it was not wealth that pressed between us, but the raw humanness of two souls, different in age, yet bound in the vulnerability of need and desire. The bargain I thought I had struck began to blur. What started as an arrangement of wealth became a complicated dance between heart and body, between expectation and reality. Love had not been promised, but something close to it had begun to grow in the cracks of what was once only convenience. And it was in those cracks, fragile and unplanned, that I found myself no longer questioning every choice, but surrendering to the strange truth that sometimes love does not arrive like a thunderstorm. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, like light slipping beneath a closed door. The woman who once measured happiness in jewels and silks began to see it instead in the way he reached for my hand without needing a reason, the way his breath steadied in sleep when my body curled into his, the way his eyes softened when I entered the room, as if, despite all that wealth had given him, he counted me as the rarest treasure. And though doubts still lingered in the darker corners of my mind, the heart knew what it had once denied, that even bargains can turn into something real, that even in choices made without love, love can find a way to be born. And so, in the silence of that grand house, amid all the echoes of gold and marble, a truth took root. A truth that comfort can become passion, that luxury can become warmth, and that even in the bargain of marriage, the heart can be surprised by its own surrender. It was never about wealth anymore. It was about the way a soul, even chained in silence, can learn to beat with love again. The nights that once felt like obligations slowly began to change. In the beginning, every touch carried the weight of duty, the kind of closeness that came because it was expected, not because it was desired. Yet something unexplainable began to shift, as if the skin could learn what the heart had not yet admitted. The hands that once felt aged and foreign started to linger in ways that awakened something unfamiliar. Each brush across the shoulder, each kiss pressed against waiting lips, stopped feeling like routine and began to carve its own language. It was in that language that tenderness melted into something else, something deeper, something I had not expected. There were moments when silence surrounded us and the world outside disappeared. His breath against my neck, slow and steady, began to ignite a heat that wealth could never buy. The man I had once agreed to marry for comfort was no longer just a provider. He became the very flame that set fire to nights I thought would always be cold. The tenderness in his touch carried patience, and that patience made desire swell in a way that left me breathless. It was not the hunger of reckless youth, but the steady burn of a passion that grew from understanding, from being seen, from being held without judgment. At first, I resisted it. I told myself that what I felt was nothing more than gratitude, nothing more than the body confusing safety with desire. Yet every time his lips pressed against mine with a gentleness that deepened into urgency, every time his hands searched for me as if I was more than a possession, the truth unraveled a little more. The heart began to betray the mind, and the body began to crave what it once only endured. Nights grew longer, not because of distance, but because of how tightly we clung to each other. The bed no longer felt like a cold contract. It became the place where something unspoken and forbidden bloomed. There was a hunger I had never admitted, a hunger that came alive in his arms. It was the way he touched not just the skin, but everything beneath it, the way his eyes lingered as if he saw beauty where I had never seen it myself. He gave a kind of passion that was not about conquering, but about worship, about giving more than taking. And in those moments, the line between duty and desire blurred completely. The truth was undeniable. What had started as wealth's bargain was now a craving that reached far beyond gold. Sometimes it was in the quiet after, when his chest became the pillow beneath my cheek, that the deepest truth struck me. The world believed this marriage was built on wealth, but behind closed doors it became something else entirely. It became heat, intimacy, surrender. Every sigh, every whispered name, every moment of his body close to mine turned into a secret too sacred to ever share. It was as though passion had been waiting patiently all along, hidden beneath layers of expectation, and once awakened, it refused to be silenced, and it did not stop with nights alone. Even in the daylight, the smallest gestures carried a weight that burned within me. A hand resting too long on the lower back, a gaze that lingered with unspoken promises, a stolen kiss when no one was watching. Each one fed the hunger, each one deepened the secret craving that grew between us. It was intoxicating, the way every glance and every touch built into something larger, something impossible to contain. What once felt like emptiness became a river that overflowed, carrying me with it, leaving me helpless against its current. I had told myself love could never grow in such a union, that passion would never belong to this marriage. And yet the body does not lie. The body responds to truth long before the mind dares to accept it. In his arms there was no calculation, no gold, no weight of vows spoken without love. In his arms there was only fire. And the more I surrendered to it, the more it consumed me, until desire itself became the language through which love began to whisper. What shocked me most was how deeply I wanted him, not for his wealth, not for what he had given me, but for the way he made me feel alive. There was a strength in his embrace, but also a vulnerability, a need that mirrored my own. It was as though every kiss, every sigh, every trembling moment was a confession of the love we had both denied but could no longer resist. The passion we shared was not a fleeting spark. It was a flame that grew brighter with every touch, every night, every stolen moment. The craving did not fade with time. It grew until the wealth became meaningless compared to the fire that lived in his arms. I had entered this marriage seeking comfort, but what I found was something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. I found myself unable to imagine nights without his warmth, unable to imagine mornings without the trace of his lips still lingering on mine. The world saw only an old man and his young wife, a union of convenience, but the truth lived in the shadows, in the fire that burned behind closed doors, in the secret craving that bound us closer than any vow ever could desire. Once awakened, cannot be put to sleep again. And in his arms, I no longer counted the cost of the bargain. I only counted the moments until I could feel him again. There were nights when the fire between us burned so intensely that everything else faded into nothingness. The world outside those walls disappeared, and all that remained was the heat of his touch, the weight of his body, the way his breath mingled with mine in the dark. Each moment of intimacy felt like surrender, a raw giving of self that erased the boundaries of age, erased the bargain that had once defined us. And yet, when the morning came and sunlight spilled across the silken sheets, guilt would rise like a shadow I could not escape. For no matter how deeply I craved him, no matter how fiercely I felt the truth in his arms, there was still the memory of why I had chosen him in the first place. Wealth, comfort, escape. The heart burned with desire, but the mind never stopped reminding me of the price. It was this conflict that tore me apart. On one side was the fire of nights that left me trembling, where passion consumed us until nothing else mattered. On the other was the quiet reality that I had entered this life not because of love, but because of what it offered. There were moments, lying with his hand curled around mine, when I wanted to believe it was only love, that wealth had nothing to do with it, that the bond between us was pure. But then I would see the jewels on my wrist, the gowns in the wardrobe, the way people looked at us in the street, and the truth pressed against me like a weight. I wanted him not for what he had, but the guilt of how it began never left me some nights. After the fire had cooled and his breathing grew steady in sleep, I would stare at the ceiling in silence. My body still ached from the hunger he awakened, but my heart ached even more. Was it real love if it was born from a bargain? Could a passion so raw erase the foundation of gold it rested on? Or was every kiss, every touch, just a beautiful lie wrapped in silk and shadows. I told myself love had grown, that desire had made it real, but deep inside the guilt whispered that perhaps I only convinced myself because I wanted it to be true. Yet when he looked at me, when his eyes softened with something so genuine it made my chest tighten, the guilt faltered. Because what I saw there was not calculation, not possession, but need, devotion, something rawer than anything I had known. He gave himself without hesitation, without demand. His hands did not just take. They gave, they lingered, they worshipped. In those moments, I knew it was not only riches that bound us. It was not only comfort. It was something deeper, something harder to name, something I both yearned for and feared still. The world around us had a way of reminding me. Guests in gilded rooms, their voices dripping with envy and curiosity, would whisper about how lucky I was. Lucky, they said, to have found a man who could give me everything. They never knew how much everything cost when weighed against the soul. They did not see the tears that sometimes came in the dark, tears that slid silently down my cheeks as I wondered whether I had traded too much. To them, it was a fairy tale. To me, it was a tightrope stretched between love and guilt, between passion and possession, and yet the passion itself was undeniable. Every time he reached for me, every time his lips found mine, the guilt dissolved into fire. The craving for him was so fierce that it consumed everything else, leaving me unable to think of wealth, unable to think of bargains. In those moments, there was no gold, no jewels, no reason but love itself. And maybe that was why the yearning cut so deeply afterward, because if it felt so real in the dark, why did the guilt scream so loud in the light? The heart longed for absolution, for the freedom to believe without doubt. But the mind knew the truth of beginnings. It was as though love had grown in soil that had been poisoned, and no matter how bright the flower bloomed, the roots always reminded me of the ground they sprang from. There were nights I wanted to confess it all to him, to tell him how the guilt clawed at me, to beg for forgiveness for having chosen him first for wealth. But then he would touch my face with such tenderness, kiss me with such depth, that the words died in my throat. Perhaps he already knew, perhaps he had always known, and perhaps love, in its truest form, is not about beginnings but about what survives despite them. The conflict never truly left. It lived inside me, a constant battle between gratitude and guilt, between yearning and doubt. But with every passing night, with every shared breath, love fought harder to claim its place. The guilt whispered that this was not real, that it could not be real. But the way my body ached for him, the way my heart quieted in his presence, the way his eyes told me I was enough, those truths silenced the whispers. More and more love born in the shadows of wealth may be questioned by the world, and even by the heart itself. But desire has a way of stripping away lies. And when desire becomes love, no weight of gold can diminish its fire, even if the guilt never fully left. The yearning always won what began as nothing more than an agreement slowly unraveled into something I never could have imagined. At first, it was a decision born of need, a step into security rather than into love. I told myself it was practical, that comfort mattered more than passion, that wealth could fill the silence where affection might have been. But time has a way of stripping away illusions, and the truth revealed itself not in the gold that adorned my wrists or the silk that brushed my skin, but in the warmth of arms I once believed I could never truly crave. The closeness that started as a duty became a language I had no choice but to learn. His presence was no longer heavy, no longer a reminder of bargains made, but instead a shelter I could not imagine losing. His voice, steady and calm, carried a tenderness that grew into a rhythm of comfort. And within that rhythm, passion bloomed. What was once routine, an expectation, turned into a storm that consumed me, a devotion that refused to be silenced. Nights stopped being obligations. They became lifelines. Every kiss, every whispered word, every trembling embrace pulled me further into a truth that wealth could never buy. I began to see the man behind the years, the man behind the riches. The lines on his face no longer spoke of age, but of a story. Struggles endured, wounds healed, and lessons learned. In those lines, I found wisdom, patience, and a gentleness that disarmed me. The hands I once accepted out of necessity became the only hands I longed for. His touch did not just ignite the body, it anchored the soul, and the fire between us burned not as a fleeting flame, but as a steady blaze that grew brighter each day the world outside would never understand. To them, it was always about the jewels, the house, the luxury that wrapped itself around me like a crown. But they did not see the moments when he reached for me in the dark simply to hold me closer. They did not hear the way he spoke my name, soft as though it was the most precious thing he had ever known. They did not feel the way his body trembled against mine when passion overcame us both, as if he was giving all of himself with every breath. Those were treasures no gold could ever match. It was not sudden, this transformation. It grew slowly, quietly, like dawn creeping over the horizon. There was a day I woke and realized that my heart no longer questioned, no longer measured worth in coins or comforts. The guilt that once lingered in the shadows of our intimacy began to fade, replaced by a truth so undeniable it left me breathless. I loved him. I loved him not for what he had, but for who he was, for the way he steadied me when the world grew heavy, for the way he cherished me as though I was both fragile and powerful all at once, for the way he made me feel seen, not as someone who had bargained her way into a life, but as someone worth loving. Beyond reason, desire had been the bridge, yes, but what lay beyond was deeper. Devotion carved itself into my bones, into my heart, until there was no part of me untouched by it. I no longer saw him as older, no longer thought of our marriage as a trade. What I saw was the man who had become my every craving, my every comfort, my every truth. His flaws became endearing, his silences became safe, his laughter became the sweetest sound I knew. And in the quiet moments, when we lay tangled together with nothing but the sound of our breaths filling the room, I understood that this was love in its truest form. The irony was that what began as a choice made for wealth ended in the discovery of something far richer than I had ever dreamed of. Gold can be touched, jewels can be held, but they are cold. His love was warm, it was alive. It was the kind of treasure that breathed life into every day. No silken gown or diamond ring could compare to the way his eyes searched mine, as if nothing else in the world mattered. No possession could equal the way his arms felt like home. No luxury could rival the simple truth of belonging to him. The storm of devotion did not simply erase the bargain. It transformed it. What had begun as a transaction became a bond so fierce it scared me with its intensity. I had not expected to find love in this union, yet it found me, swept me away, and showed me a depth of feeling that no amount of wealth could ever replace. The craving that once began in the body grew into something that lived in the soul. And in that realization I found freedom. Freedom from guilt, freedom from doubt, freedom from the lies I once told myself. Looking back, I see now that the bargain was only the beginning. The true story was never about wealth, never about escape. It was about the way two souls can collide in the most unexpected of places, how desire can awaken love, and how love, once realized, can transform everything it touches. What began as a transaction ended as the truest devotion I have ever known. Thank you for staying with me through this journey of love, desire, conflict, and realization. If this story touched your heart, let it stay alive by sharing it, by liking it, and by subscribing to the channel where truth and passion are spoken without fear. Every story here is a reflection of what it means to be human, to crave, to question, and to surrender. Stay close, because the next story may be the one that mirrors your own hidden truth. Until then, keep love alive, and I'll meet you in the next chapter.